Many leading artists of 1968 were not part of the counterculture. Tom Stoppard, by then a successful playwright, took no active part in the demonstrations and made his position clear in his 2006 play, Rock and Roll.
What about 1968?
What happened in 1968?
Revolution.
Oh, you'll have to help me. I've got that disease where you can't remember the name of it.
Candida means the cultural revolution. No, I don't. I mean the occupations. Paris, the LSE, or in my case, Hornsey Conjoint.
Oh, yes, the occupations. Do you remember the occupation of 68, yeah?
Grandpa,
What?
do you know what? Max knows damn well what I'm talking about. You're all high on bringing down capitalism.
Bringing down capitalism was Canada's youthful indiscretion.
Street theatre.
And ending war. All war, not just Vietnam.
At the end of the play, there's an argument around a table
Yes.
about 1968, and Max dismisses the events of that year as street theatre. Is
Yes.
that what you feel?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, Melvin, I think it rather was. Capitalism was apparently going to be overthrown by gesture and by theatre. Dressing up, marching, chanting, feeling that you count for something. It was fine. I just thought it was, as it were, not really serious, and certainly not a serious threat to anybody. You can butt in here and tell me your personal experiences.
I did go on some marches, but I suppose we were looking for a sort of significance that we had to manufacture because it wasn't really there. But we didn't want to be left out. There was something about that.
It's really embarrassing, this conversation, but to be truthful, I was embarrassed by what was going on and thought that it was narcissistic.
I don't know what you mean about the dressing up. I wore a camouflage jacket and combat boots. Oh, I see what you mean. But I also had a sergeant leather coat from Chelsea Girl. No, okay, so we dressed up. So what? We were very political. My boyfriend was a black dwarf cartoonist.
As somebody who'd been adopted by England, I felt rather indebted to the country and thought it was perfectly absurd that in just about, well, one of the very few places where anything amounting to free expression and democracy was, you know, the orthodox wisdom and the orthodox practice, that in such a place there should be a lot of people who were determined to overthrow it.
By August 1968, the counterculture had spread all over the world. In Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring had relaxed restrictions on television and radio, allowing new kinds of art and music to flood in. To what extent do you think that the Prague Spring was influenced by these happenings, these events, these marches, these songs and protests in the West?
I think very much so. There was a huge fascination for popular culture, popular arts. They aped the West. They imbibed it, partly because it was forbidden and therefore precious.
Flew in from Miami Beach, BUAC. Didn't get to bed last night. On the way to paperback was on my knee. Man, I had a dreadful flight. I'm back in the USSR.
On August the 21st, 1968, Russian tanks arrived in Prague to crush Dubček's political and cultural reforms. Tom Stoppard's 2006 play Rock and Roll begins at this point and explores the true story of the underground Czech rock band The Plastic People of the Universe, who came to symbolize the struggle for freedom in Czechoslovakia.
The band were formed in September '68, and the Russians invaded in August, and these two events were simply not connected. They were not politicals. They didn't consider themselves to be making political gestures. They were just completely obsessed with Western rock and roll.
I'm waiting for my man. $26 in my hand.
The Plastic People of the Universe took their name from a Frank Zappa song and learned how to play rock music by covering hits from bands like the Velvet Underground. But from the outset, they ran into trouble with the authorities, who disliked their music and their way of life. In this scene from the Royal Court's production of Rock and Roll, Jan, a follower of the Plastics, asks his friend Ferdinand to support a petition protesting against the mistreatment of the band.
The fans
fans just want to be left alone, do their thing.
This isn't about the fans, it's about the band.
Same thing.
You want me to ask serious men
Women, too, would be good.
who are working in boiler rooms and timber yards
breweries, right, yeah, famous odd job men.
to invite the police to arrest them
Arrest them? For what?
so that you and your druggy dropout weirdo mates with hair down to here can do their own thing. You're an arsehole.
That's a no, then.
The plastics were managed by the radical art historian Ivan Hiros.
My jsme chtěli dělat svoje věci, svoje, řekněme tomu, umění. To prostě vyplynulo z toho, že si uzurpuje právo vládnout vším, co se kolem a pod ním děje. Vytvářet umění nezávisle na politické moci.
Ivan Yuros took them over and became their moral conscience and their political conscience. Really what he was demonstrating was that you can't really make a distinction between detachment and dissent. You know, if you say, look, I'm just not part of this dreadful version of society, I've opted out, that is dissent as far as Yuros was concerned, and he was, you know, as it were, jailed to prove his point.
It's better not to start by cutting your hair, Yuros says. No, it is necessary. Then nothing you do can possibly give support to the idea that everything is in order in this country. Now, why couldn't you explain this?
Tom Stoppard based the character of Ferdinand, the political dissident who comes to understand the importance of the plastics, on his friend, the playwright Václav Havel.
When Yuros and the band were arrested, Havel had just kind of got the idea that they mattered. And Havel saw that to be arrested because of the way you look, the way you dress, the kind of music you make, and above all, for your apparent indifference, was, if anything, more serious than coming down hard on people who stood up and tried to argue with the government.
It's rather Wildian, isn't it? It's art for the sake of art.
Yes.
And it's also the idea that art pursued for the sake of art is itself the most destructive of any uniform society, and particularly of any authoritarian society.
Yes. What appears to be beauty for beauty's sake becomes a rebuke to the sort of structures of society.
Now, other bands have better musicians, but the Plastics are the only band safe from the desire for recognition. Now, in the alternative culture, success is failure. Just look at what happens in the West, Yuros says.
Yeah, the Grateful Dead must be so envious of the Plastic.
Já jsem vždycky doufal, že kolem Plastic People soustředím nejlepší lidi našeho národa. A tam se to stalo vlastně už.
I'm a stranger to everything. I love you alone.
After years of persecution by the Czech authorities, Hiros and 3 other members of the band were finally tried and imprisoned. This prompted Václav Havel and others to set up Charter 77, the human rights organisation which laid the foundation for the Velvet Revolution of 1989 and a free Czechoslovakia. Today, 40 years after they formed in 1968, the Plastic People of the Universe are performing live as part of the Czech production of Tom Stoppard's Rock and Roll.
Mr. Sex, drogy, rock and roll.